In a world where stability reigns supreme, one woman walked away from certainty. She traded in comfort for chaos, pay slips for pressure, and chose to bet on the only thing she truly trusted, herself. This is Holly, a fearless founder, a relentless problem solver, and a professional oversharer on a mission to tell the truth about what it really takes to create brands from scratch. No filters, no fluff, just the crazy chaos of entrepreneurship. It's the keeping up with the Kardashians of brand building, but with more spreadsheets, some glam, and hopefully fewer Kim K ugly cries. This is not just a YouTube channel. This is HVB's founder show, and the show you didn't know you needed. What are you waiting for? Let's get into it.
Hello! What is wrong with the angles here? How are we all doing today? If you want to sell your brand one day, you need to watch this. Hold on to your hats. Hi there. Welcome back to the channel. I hope you've had a fantastic week. I am very excited, feeling very motivated, very pumped. If you are a brand founder, if you have already started a brand, if you are well into your brand journey, if you are just interested in what makes brands tick and what do investors look for when purchasing a brand, or if you just have dreams of selling your brand for hundreds of millions of pounds, I know I do. That is undeniably the goal. Doesn't mean I'm any less passionate about what I'm building. I'm in this to build an incredibly successful brand. I was invited to an event with CEW. Now, CEW, for those who don't know, they've been an incredibly supportive and helpful network founded by Sally Berkeley, and it is honestly one of the most enjoyable industry brands for everything you ever need to know in the beauty industry. I wrote everything down in this book, multiple pages. Here are my very best tidbits and takeaways from this incredible session this morning on mergers and acquisitions with Houlihan Lokey and the CEW team. Very transparent about what brands look for, what makes you stand out, things to absolutely avoid if you are thinking of selling your brand ever. And I think what is an immense privilege is the fact that obviously we are a few months out from launch, and we have the opportunity, whilst building the foundational elements of the brand, to really make sure we're taking the right steps from the get-go. And we're laying the bricks, and we're laying them well and sturdily, so that in the future, we didn't lay them piss poorly and we're having to fix a broken wall or a cracked floor. Point number one, brand equity. How do people speak about your brand? That is one of the single-handedly most important things that investors will look for on people that are buying your brand. But not only how do they speak about your brand, but how efficacious is the product? And that in itself feeds into the brand equity. So investors are going to look for how effective is your product? What is your retention rate? If it's a really strong product, that then means that people should, in theory, be coming back to purchase again and again and again. Repeat purchase rates are so important when selling a brand, and that is really something that we faced into with Skinrocks. We had a really high repeat retention rate. Our customers were very, very loyal. If as a brand you are having to spend more and more money to get more customers, that is a complete red flag to investors, because ultimately, when does it end? Customer growth should grow organically, also through investment, through channels like paid. However, if you are having to spend more and more money to get more customers, that is concerning and something that you definitely need to get a hold of. Gross margin. Now, gross margin, if you're wondering, is the cost of manufacturing your goods before any of the additional costs like HR, marketing, legal, administrative costs, anything like that. Any of that is not included in the gross margin. The gross margin is typically your cost of good. Houlihan Lokey mentioned that they also look at the outbound cost of distribution. So getting it into your wholesalers, for example. The ideal dream gross margin that they're looking for is 65%, nothing less, maybe more, but nothing less than 65% as a gross margin. Now, some brands gasped in the audience when they said that. Fragrance, don't even get me started. The margins there are just absolutely disgusting. You'd be absolutely disgraced. Fragrance is expensive as a retail price, not to make. Disgusting how much some fragrance brands cost to make. Disgusting. And the fragrance brands should be ashamed of themselves. So it's actual daylight robbery, in my opinion. But anyway, that's a topic for a different video. Trademarks. They mention this and it's really important. I know I harp on about it, and I'm sure people who watch these videos will just feel like, oh, bloody hell, she's going on about trademarks again. Yes, I am going on about trademarks. One of the most important things, and also having lived it as well with Skin Rocks, trademarks and regulatory aspects are one of the first things that investors and buyers will look for, because the slightest discrepancy or gap from a regulatory perspective leaves your brand open to massive risk. Trademarks are protection, and trademarks say to an investor, we have the IP, we own the IP to this brand. Another very interesting point, which I think is worth discussing, is obviously we live in a world of TikToks and Instagrams and social media everywhere. You have to remember that a lot of these brands, such as L'Oreal, Estee Lauder, Puig, they've all been around in the industry for a very, very, very long time. And so with that, there are historical strategies, operational foundations that are very different to like modern day. How you launch a beauty brand now in comparison to like 50 years ago is obviously a completely different ballgame. So one of the questions asked was around how these huge conglomerates really approach brands that have ultimately built entirely on a channel such as TikTok, for example. The word I'm looking for is omnichannel. Omnichannel means, for those who aren't sure, omnichannel is a strategy as to how and where your product is retailed. Omnichannel means multiple channels, aka D2C, your own website. Boots, a multi-branded retailer. That is physical and online. Health, the health and wellness online retailer. B2B, do you retail your products in clinics? There's a real balancing act between working and investing in brands that have shown exponential growth on a channel like TikTok. But if you are a brand, and I do see their point, if you are a brand who has fundamentally grown exclusively on TikTok, for example, I was watching Dragon's Den the other night, and I was watching the story around hair syrup and the founder, Lucy McLeod, I think, or Lucy Cloyd. Sorry if you're watching this. And I think what was really interesting was obviously her whole brand has been built on TikTok. I'm sure she has other channels now, and I think now she's gone into Boots and Sephora and whatever. So like amazing. It just emphasizes the importance of omni-channel approaches. Now, building a D2C brand is all well and good from a margins perspective. You have a lot more margin to work with. You're obviously not selling to a retailer, which typically they take between sort of like 50, 60% in some cases. Depends how well you're negotiating. But they can take 50 to 60% off your retail price, right? So like you're then left with a much smaller margin once you take away all of your costs of manufacturing your product. So profitability wise, not the most profitable to go into a retailer. But obviously, if you do go into a retailer, you have to accept that you then don't have all of the logistics costs associated. If you were to sell online on your own website, you're then responsible for shipping or the marketing associated with retailing online. Whereas if you go into a wholesaler, they obviously then support that with their own marketing, and you're also getting your brand out there into, in Boots's case, thousands of stores. So omni-channel presence is very important and something that investors really look for when choosing whether to invest in a brand. I think in this digital day and age, very important to consider, because I think brands typically lean towards a more digital first approach, which is great, but you need to be thinking about your omnichannel strategy as a whole, because investors want to know about that. Really important factor to layer onto that is it spreads the risk. If you're a brand that just retails exclusively on TikTok, what happens if TikTok's banned in the UK? The whole thing goes down. What are you going to do then? How's your business then? So the benefit of having omnichannel, and where omnichannel really shows a strength of brand, is the risk spreading that it does. Typically, buyers and investors invest in brands with 60 to 70% traditional retail, ordinary. Prior to their investment, they've had about 3 rounds of investment now, and obviously are owned by Lauder, and they kind of just like, there was a strategy there in terms of investing and then investing again and again. To the point where now Lauder own, I think, pretty much the entirety. But they went from a very modest, I say modest, it was like 20 million sales a year online, predominantly D2C. Look at them now. Boots. I'd actually heard that Deciem, the sales of The Ordinary in Boots are to rival that of Coca-Cola. That's the size at which they are. So impressive. Would they have got there without the backing from Lauder? I would argue probably not. But what it does is that investment from a brand such as Lauder, when you think about all of the brands that sit within their umbrella, where are they stocked? All your major retailers. So you immediately get to open doors through association. Big players in the market, big buyers in the market, like all the ones I've mentioned, L'Oreal, Lauder, Shiseido, Elf, Coty, all of these big guys, they ain't going to look at a brand that's doing less than 50 million a year in revenue, is the guidance. If you follow me on Instagram, and if you don't, you definitely should. See, I've been talking about this a lot recently because of the Rhode X Elf. A grand total of $1 billion. Small pocket change to some, life-changing amounts of money to others. And the panel talk today was all about what's going on in M&As really in the beauty industry. And as a brand, how can you stand out? What are buyers looking for in this day and age and in this market? So some brands that were recently acquired. Let's talk over the last few years. Some key brands that you'll definitely have heard of. Youth for the People, Deciem, Charlotte Tilbury, one of Puig's biggest acquisitions and probably greatest. Sol de Janeiro was bought by L'Occitane. Sol de Janeiro was an indie brand that absolutely skyrocketed to fame after acquisition. And one of the key things that we were talking about in the panel, and it was a very interactive session, someone asked a question in the audience and said, I think it's widely known that when brands are acquired, particularly in beauty, that the quality of the products are perceived to go down because you have big guys at the top who, by the most part, are interested in making cuts to ensure that the brand is as lucrative as it possibly can so that their return on investment down the line becomes the biggest that it possibly can be. Now, if you acquire a brand where their MPD and their cost of good is incredibly high, anyone who comes in and looks at that business is ultimately going to go, it costs you £25 to make your serum. Your margins are small. We've got to cut this down. And obviously when you cut costs down in that area, what that then ultimately means is that the quality of the products go down, which has happened in a lot of brands. I'm not going to name any, but there are definitely some brands out there that after having received investment, considerably reduce the quality of their products. And in turn, in my opinion, damages the brand. And from a reputability perspective, consumers are confused because they're thinking like a brand by the most part that's like different to what it was prior to investment, but yet the quality of the products are poor, or that like je ne sais quoi. That's a really important thing that not happen to every brand, but like Sol, for example, is a great example of a brand that's actually like benefited off the investment because what it's done is able to like springboard them onto just like a different stratosphere of success. Cost of good is a really important one, and when you're building a brand, it's one of the most important things to really consider, because you would hope that as you scale your brand, and I know I've spoken about this before, as your brand scales, the cost of goods should come down because of economies of scale. You're buying more products, you're buying in bigger bulk, so obviously then that could mean that you bring the individual ingredients down in cost. But if you're starting with like a £25 a unit cost of good and you're retailing it for £40, you're going to be considerably challenged to expand into that space, if I'm completely honest. For those interested, what happened basically in sort of like 2021 was that we saw a huge amount of beauty brands being bought and invested in with quite inflated market values. Typically, market values during that period of time were made at about 5x the annual revenue, which is generous. But it is, if not doing by EBITDA, you're doing it by revenue. However, now, obviously, over the years, because a lot of investment firms invested in these brands that were doing astronomical sales, possibly because of COVID. COVID was a fantastic time for skincare because obviously no one was really buying makeup, but a lot of people were watching their faces on Zoom and thought, oh, a bit of a fine line there. I need to get some serum going on my visage. So a lot of brands saw rapid growth during that period of time, but were they able to sustain it? The answer to a lot of them was no, which meant then because of those failed investments, because they were bought at a time where everything was booming, just like the stock market, it's the same thing, right? Like if a business is completely going like this, or rather this, what's to say that that's going to sustain when you have a huge crash or rather change in market, which post-COVID consumer behavior was very different. who's to say that you can sustain that? So then what that did was made private investors and brands that invested in those brands nervous. So then you had people just pulling back on making these big acquisitions, and so has subsequently brought down the multiplier to about 4. So 4 times the revenue. So for example, with Rhode, Hailey Bieber's brand, that was generating about $200 million in revenue. The deal was made up of a few different variables, but ultimately the deal was about 800 million, with 200 million to be paid out at a later date. 4 times the annual revenue would give you, usually in this market, your exit price. $800 million plus the 200, I mean, let's call it a billion. Not a bad day's work for the old Hailey Bieber. My very final for this episode, and I really hope that this was interesting because there was so much solid advice. There is a fly in the room. Why is there always something that it insists on getting in my way? The whole debate around founder brands versus non-founder brands. There was a few conversations in the audience around, there are brands that are built on celebrity or famous or well-known founders. Take Caroline Hirons, for example. Take Dr. Murad of Murad, for example. He used him as an example because he was like, he's 75. Bringing about any more flogging his brand? Probably not so much, but was he the name of the brand? Charlotte Tilbury, Hailey Bieber. This rise of brands entering the market from founder-led, where the founder is very, 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 you have to ask yourself as investors, and investors do get a little bit nervous because they perceive the fact that obviously if you're acquiring a brand, what does that deal structure look like? Because is the founder going to remain? Some founders have spent 10, 15, 20 years building these brands. They just want to bugger off to the Bahamas. So brands, investors, their money, they want to ensure that that brand continues to show growth year on year. Investors look for year on year 30% growth in a brand. That is a strong signifier of a investable opportunity. How present do you want to be as a founder in the front-facing nature of the brand? Because ultimately, like the goal, when we were building Skim Rocks, obviously Caroline could have named the brand her own personal name. She could have called the brand Caroline Hirons. But long term, the strategy is obviously to build something that exists outside of herself. Because what we've seen with Charlotte Tilbury, I mean, phenomenal brand. I'm going to sit here and say she's not built a phenomenal brand, but like reliant on her as a person. And that's why they're now, introducing Sophia and niece, and so much that obviously only one person can do. One person can't do it all. So building a brand with a founder very much at the face of it is fantastic at building a community, because what that means is you give your community or your consumer someone to personally identify with. However, as we've seen with Aimee Smales Oddmuse founder, she's under a lot of backlash at the moment. Don't necessarily agree with it, but she's under a lot of backlash. Just starting a new language here, guys. Join me. She's facing a lot of backlash, and because she is a front-facing founder, it's a lot easier to tear a person down than it is to tear a brand down when the founder is so at the forefront, and you have to be a bit more protective or very considered as to how that founder presents themselves into the market. So founder versus non-founder led brands, there's arguments for both, and I don't necessarily think that it's a deterrent for investors. It is just something that is very important to consider, and is 1,000,000% something that is often spoke about in those investor rooms, because it just adds on another layer of risk. And how do you ensure that that founder is going to remain very much involved from the sale through to the future of brand? So that's why I think it's going to be very telling to see how Hailey involves herself in the brand. Rhode obviously is acquired by Elf, and she's got a few more of their other brands' pies, and it will just be interesting to see how her involvement flows through. So they're my key takeaways. I hope you enjoyed them. That's it. Thank you for watching. See you next Sunday. Have a lovely, lovely week.